Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another collaboration between Darwinian Delusions and Pondering Soul. We are continuing with part 3 of nihilism. This is the dissertation that Yusuf did when he was at university. In the previous sessions, we covered the meaning of meaning. We also covered the inescapability of nihilism and how with industrialization, urbanization, all of us are going to have to face this. Atheists, theists, and people with little or no interest in nihilism, they will have to actually face this monster that's actually coming, which Nietzsche predicted. So today we're actually going to talk about two particular responses to nihilism and how both of those responses, they still require the same fundamental thing. So firstly, assalamu alaikum, Yusuf.
Wa alaikum salam. How you doing?
Alhamdulillah. So let's get started with a quick segue. How did we get to where we are now, which is is it part 2?
It's part 2 of the essay. It's part 3 of our video conversation series thing. So basically the first 2 videos covered section 1 and 2 of part 1 of my dissertation. Inshallah, depending on how this goes, we'll try and get through the entirety of part 2 today. Basically, it takes a bit to talk about Kierkegaard. Camus is much more accessible, especially to laymen, people who are not necessarily familiar with philosophy. And then there's going to be a comparison between the two, where I kind of draw out a common theme between them, despite at first glances, especially if you just take them at their own word, you would think that Camus is somehow kind of juxtaposed to Kierkegaard, and he even goes as far as criticizing him in his work. So basically, part 2 is covering this idea of the leap of faith and the necessity of leaps of faith for finite beings. And so I kind of break this up into 3 parts. The first part looks at Kierkegaard, who's a Danish Christian philosopher who he lived before Nietzsche, but he's often referred to as the granddaddy of existentialism. And the reason for that is that he has a lot of work dealing with this idea of the absurd, or life being absurd, or the experience of life being absurd. And his philosophy kind of revolves around this concept of absurdity and how to respond to it. With Camus, he's a post-Nietzschean. He lived in World War II, or through World War II. I think he was actually from Algeria. He was a French Algerian. So he lived in North Africa. And I think a lot of his work was influenced by the atrocities of World War II. And I think this was a common theme after World War II. A lot of people were aware of the kind of horrors that had faced the world as a result of these kind of super industrialized wars. And it kind of tested a lot of people's faith. And he was one of the kind of the main people that came out of this existential crisis. He was very familiar with both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And again, his work deals with this kind of absurdity of life. So I guess we'll begin. First of all, it's probably good to give a little definition of faith. There's I've got 2 definitions here. There's complete trust or confidence in someone or something. So it's just you put your complete trust in them. And you, despite them not necessarily giving you the evidence directly, you have confidence that they know what they're doing. So you can have faith in them. Or it can also be known as the strong belief in the doctrine of a religion based on spiritual conviction rather than proof. And with that, that's a nice little kind of segue into this whole thing. But we'll just kind of move on to section 1 of this part 2 talks about the night of faith. Now, Kierkegaard is most famous for his work called Fear and Trembling, which is a discussion from the Christian perspective off the story of Abraham and his command to sacrifice his son. And for Kierkegaard, he's basically a bit annoyed with how philosophy had developed up until that point. And he talks about how like philosophers have gone as far as giving like scripts for things like the concepts of love and all these other weird abstract concepts that you can come up with. But no one's ever spoke in praises of faith. If anything, it's always been kind of brushed aside or trivialized. And so he thinks philosophy has neglected the concepts of faith, but that it shouldn't have necessarily been neglected, that there may be something of importance in this idea of faith or in submission to faith. And so he focuses in on the sacrifice story with Abraham to kind of get this point across. And he points out something really weird. He points out, if anyone was to approach you and say, listen, God has told me I've got to go kill my son. Yeah. If someone was in a church and they just stood up and said, I've got to sacrifice my son, they would be referred to as a murderer. They'd be pointed out as insane. It wouldn't be considered ethical in any sense. And so you have this kind of standard ethical norm within society that says it's wrong to end the life of your child. Yet Abraham is one of the most praised people on the planet. And the reason he is because he's recognized by the three major monotheistic religions, both Judaism and Christianity, and also Islam. And he's praised for this thing, which, if done by anybody else, would have been considered abhorrent. And so why is this juxtaposition there? Like, why is this kind of this mismatch in terms of our values, where if someone we know was to try to commit the deeds that Abraham committed, we would question them severely and probably chastise them for it. But when we're reading about the story of Abraham, we submit to it. We refer to him as the father of faith. One of the first great prophets. And so this juxtaposition interests him, and so he wants to elucidate this in his work called Fear and Trembling. And so in the book, he gives a number of different accounts where it's kind of like a creative endeavor, where because in the stories themselves, there's very, very little information. Like, that like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to Abraham through a dream. This dream communicates something to him. In the Islamic version, he speaks to his son and says, I've been told, I had a dream that I was to sacrifice you, and his son submits. In the Christian version of this, his son isn't aware. And so, there's this adds a different element. And so Kierkegaard talks about the process of him packing his bags and telling his son he's got to go on a journey. And, they get the donkey out, and he doesn't say anything to his wife. He doesn't say anything to his son. And then they go on this really long journey from his home to the mountain. And, when you're reading the story in the books, it doesn't tell you or make you, it's inferred in the writing, but it doesn't give you an account of what occurs on that journey while he's going on his way to the sacrifice of his son. And he kind of longs it out a little bit. They're very short stories, but he kind of opens up this opportunity for this kind of creative addition to it. And he does it in several different ways. So he'll repeat the story, and each time he changes it a little bit. And he makes you, for a moment, consider what it must have been like on that journey, to be Abraham, to be on his donkey, and to move ever so slowly towards this destination where he was going to sacrifice something that was the most prized thing he, in terms of what he loved of the dunya, what he loved on the world. His son was up there. He was over 100 years old, and he'd wanted a son for so long, and this was his firstborn, according to the Christian. Which way round is it? The Christians think the opposite of us.
The Christians think it's Isaac,
which is the second born.
Isaac is the young one, I believe. Ismail is the.
His first son is with the maiden, his wife's servant.
And I think the second one's with Sarah.
Yeah.
Or sorry, the second one's with the maiden, I think.
I'm not sure we've got that right there, because I remember that the whole reason that his wife asked him to try to have a child with her servant was because they thought that they weren't going to be able to have children themselves. And then
Right.
his servant became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And then the angels came, or the angels had appeared prior to that. And then it turned out that she was pregnant afterwards. And then when she found out that she was going to have her own son, she wanted the servant to leave and to take the child with her. And so the difference in the stories with us, we believe that the firstborn was the one that he had to take to sacrifice, which would have been the son of the servant, and the Christians believed it was the secondborn that gave rise to the tribes of Judea, or to the Jewish people. And so for them, like, his son was the son that he had with his wife was the most prized of anything that he's ever had a connection with on earth.
Yeah.
And so this was a major sacrifice for him, and he's trying to get you to really put yourself in this position where you truly believe in God, and that there is no doubt in your mind that God exists, and that this thing, which is the greatest of all beings, the creator of all things, has given you this ultimatum: you've got to go and sacrifice something that you love on earth more than anything else in order to prove your commitment to that which is the creator of everything. And he dwells on it, and he makes you think about how horrible it must have been to have climbed the mountain and to head towards the point of sacrifice and to hold the knife against your son's neck and to go through these motions. And like I say, he repeats it a couple of times, maybe 3 or 4. And in reading this, you feel like you're walking with Abraham, and that you're going through these motions, and obviously you have to put yourself in the position where you're presupposing the existence of God. Like, you're assuming that God exists. You're assuming that he has been commanded to make this decision, to fulfill it, to act it out, and that all the while he's kind of bearing it on his own, because from the Christian perspective, he doesn't tell anyone. He keeps it a secret. And in this process, like I say, it takes you on this mad little journey where you've really got to kind of put yourself in his shoes. And it's really useful. And he's also trying to paint this idea that faith is valuable. And the reason he talks about this whole thing, he starts to basically mention this idea of the knight of faith. And the knight of faith is someone who, bear with me. There we go. So the knight of faith requires what he calls the movement of faith, which is a leap of faith. By the way, he says the word faith a lot in his explanation of these things. So the knight of faith requires a movement of faith on what he refers to as the strength of the absurd, which is and all of this, the strength of the absurd is basically this, despite the absurdity of life, that this offers you some sort of power, and that this power enables you to be able to make this leap of faith. And he says, in order to get to this point where you can become a knight of faith, first and foremost, you need to commit to the act of infinite resignation. And the act of infinite resignation, this is why in my essay, if anyone manages to go and read it, I spend more time on Kierkegaard than I do with Camus. And the main reason is he has all these terms, and if you're not familiar with them, they can be quite weird and throw you off a little bit. So I've pulled up the quote from Fear and Trembling in terms of what he's explaining what the infinite resignation thing is. So infinite resignation is the act that knows the bliss of infinity. He has felt the pain of renouncing everything, whatever is most precious in the world, and yet to him finitude tastes just as good as to the one who has never known anything higher. For his remaining in the finite bore no trace of stunted, anxious training, and he still has this sense of being secure to take pleasure in it, as though it were the most certain thing of all. And yet, he says that twice, by the way, I didn't just repeat that for no reason. And yet, the whole earthly form he presents is a new creation on the strength of the absurd. He resigned everything infinitely and then took everything back on the strength of the absurd. He is continually making the movement of infinity, but he makes it with such accuracy and poise that he continually is getting finitude out of it. So basically, the knight of faith is someone who is able to give up everything in the world. And he does this because when he looks at the world, and every time he tries to use his reason, every time he tries to grasp things and look upon the world, he's constantly met with paradoxes, with absurdity. He can never get it. And the more he tries to dig deeper, the more he tries to grasp hold of it, the more it seems ungraspable. And so basically, eventually at some point, the knight of faith submits to the absurdity. He submits that these things are beyond his grasp. That there are things much greater than him, and no matter how rational he is, no matter how reasonable he might want to be, that there are things that are just never going to be within his capacity to understand it. And so this is where this idea of faith starts to come in, that like you have no ability to necessarily understand the world, but now you've got a choice. Is it that it's difficult to understand? Is it your fault? Is it because you're a finite being and you're just incapable? Or is it because it is actually absurd? And, it's one of the two answers. And you can't necessarily know which one it is for sure. And this is the nature of the problem. It's one or the other. But because, like, if one is true, if it is because we're finite, then we're stuck in our finite position. We can't go beyond that. And so we can't confirm that it is just simply because we're finite. But then if it is absurd, and if there is no sense in the world, we can't confirm that either. Because to be able to confirm it would be to be able to make sense of the world and then say, oh yeah, everything is definitely absurd. And so we're left in this problem. It's a paradoxical one, and you will either incline to one or the other. But this either decision requires faith, because it's something you can't confirm. You can't know for certain necessarily that the world isn't absurd, or that it is. And you've got to deal with this problem, and you do so by inclining towards some sort of faith. And
there's a slight confusion in my head. So when Kierkegaard uses the absurd, he means something different to when Camus says the absurd.
Well, Camus is influenced by Kierkegaard. So the absurd is a subjective experience.
What I thought was going on was that when Kierkegaard says the absurd, he's basically saying that you have to take a leap of faith, which is absurd from a rational point of view, that you're giving up everything and you're putting your trust in something. And I thought when Camus uses the absurd, he means that life is meaningless and you just have to face that reality. That's what the absurd is.
So, yeah, it depends on in certain parts of their writing, they're approaching the absurd in a kind of multi-dimensional way. So with Kierkegaard, his decision to make a leap of faith is absurd. And yes, you're right in pointing that out. It's basically, he refers to it as believing in the impossible, but not denying that it's impossible.
Yes.
And things like that. And it's weird language, but it's all based to do with this idea of faith being beyond the reach of reason.
Yep.
And he's making a parallel, like before we mentioned in the earlier parts of the essay, that meaning might be beyond the grasps of reason.
Yeah.
And if that is so, you can't just break it down analytically. And the reason mainly would be because it's tied to the experience of life, which means it's tied to the subjective experience of living. And when you're trying to deal with objectivity, you're trying to escape the subjective perspective. You're trying to view the life not from the perspective. You're trying to view the world not from the perspective of life, but from the perspectivalist perspective that I've mentioned a couple of times.
Yeah.
And to transcend subjectivity, to reach this holy grail of perspective. And so for Kierkegaard, he's trying to say, well, maybe faith is beyond the reach of reason. In the same way that meaning, like I've explained it before, would be beyond the reach of reason.
Yeah.
And faith is to be understood through the experience of it, not through rational explanation. And so what he's saying here is that maybe the mechanics of faith is something like, when someone says, what does an apple taste like if they've never tasted an apple? It's like, how are you expecting me to explain this to you? You need to...
Irreducible.
Say again?
It's irreducible. You can't break it into some sort of small components.
Yeah, it's not necessarily this mechanical thing that you could map out on a blueprint and then go, look, this part affects this part and this, blah, 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 blah. There's something about it that you need to taste. I think Al-Ghazali talks about this as well, or there is an Islamic philosopher.
He does, he does, yeah.
And
in Deliverance, he does mention, we could cover that another time because it gets quite deep with him.
Yeah, I can imagine. But yeah, it's something that you need to taste for yourself. You need to experience it.
It's beyond reason, yeah.
Yeah, and in order to taste it, in order to experience it, you need to submit to it. You need to actively have faith, and to be aware that you're having faith, and to not shy away from that. Because at the moment, today's age, they really make the word faith into this dirty word, and to the point where even Muslims and other believers feel really weird. Like I've got a few friends that I talk to, and like I'm constantly trying to tell them about the importance of faith, and often it'll get mischaracterized, and people go, there's a comment, and he might even watch this. One of your commenters, he's mentioned, and I watched a video on it recently, actually. What was it called? I've not managed to finish it. Rationality and blind faith in Islam. One of your recent videos.
Yeah.
And he's basically making the claim that because you've had a video on this, that you're making the claim that Islam is completely blind faith. And that's all that it is. It's only blind faith. Reason doesn't play any part in your accepting of it. And this is a complete straw man, as far as I'm aware. That it's not that it's completely blind to faith. It's not that don't question anything. Like, you're just a Muslim and that's it. And when we're talking to all the non-Muslims, you just need to become Muslim, and I don't need to explain to you why. You've just got to submit. Take blind faith. It's important. It's a ridiculous argument. That's not what anyone in the Dawah is doing. What it is generally that any kind of blind faith that's involved follows from the conclusions that God exists, that the Quran is the word of God, and that Muhammad is a prophet, peace be upon him. And once you've established these, which you can do using reason, not blind faith, then you can start to accept things, quote unquote, dogmatically. And and the reason is because, again, of our finitude, that and this is similar to the quote that I mentioned quite a lot for anyone who's familiar with me online. It's the Nietzsche quote, that one of the major issues with Christianity was that, how it developed into its current form anyway, was that it was supposed to be a complete system. God is all-knowing. God is the only one that's capable of giving you a system that is, perfect, in the sense that it can be translated through all times and all peoples, and it takes into account the human condition in its perfect form. And it only works insofar as you have belief in God and you have trust in God's ability to offer you this kind of system. The second you get rid of God, nothing, and obviously with Christianity as well, when they did believe in God, everything else was not questionable, because to question it and to try to deviate from that would by necessity, if God exists, be a deviation from perfection. And it would be a decline in the religion. Anything that's adapted by the human being would make this structure less perfect, because it had already been perfect in the first place. And you know, and this is true. And so if you accept that this is, you know, a true religion, then by necessity you also have to accept the rules that come along with that, whether or not you can understand them. And the reason you would say you're not necessarily able to understand them is because you don't have God's perspective. You don't have this all-knowing capacity. You're not all-wise. You're not all-seeing, all-hearing, all of these things which God is. And obviously, if he's giving you a structure to build a society upon, it would necessarily make that society successful. And you see that, you know, we believe that God did speak to all the previous people. So he did speak to the Jews. He did speak to the people who became the Christians. And in doing so, he gave them the ability to be successful in the world. And inevitably, he ended up speaking to the Muslims and gave them the ability to be successful in the world. And so all of this is not only blind faith. There's a relationship between faith and there's a relationship between reason. And these things are all intermingled in part of being a religious person. And so I was only mentioning that gentleman as a little side topic there, but yeah, so faith understood through experience, not necessarily a rational explanation, and any attempts to try to grasp this idea of faith logically would, if it is beyond the grasp of reason, would always be unfruitful. And you know, if you're trying to do it, and if you're dogmatically rational, and you know, you've put your trust in reason being able to delve into every part of the world and every part of the human experience. If you are dogmatically sold this, then it would follow from that when you try to delve into these things that should be on the grasp of reason, that you would dismiss them, and you would dismiss them as useless. And so this occurs with things like meaning isn't meaningful, and nihilism arises. Faith is useless. We don't need that, and they dismiss it. But then all you need to do is you ask the question, well, why are you so sure reason and rationality is something that is able to kind of guide us through the world? And this concept of Husserl that I've mentioned with you before as well. You know, if reason evolved with us, then that by necessity means that reason changed. It developed. It wasn't in existence once, it came into existence. And then as we developed, it developed as well. And it changed, and what it was is it isn't now, and what it will be will be different from how it is at the moment. And if all of this is true, then there's not a necessary reason why you should be trusting reason. You have to have faith in it, and you know, this itself is a leap of faith. And unless they admit that, they have to give reasons to why they're accepting faith, and they end up in the circular argument thing. And to be clear again, this isn't postmodernism. You know, we're not saying philosophy and logic and reason don't have their uses, you know, and that you should dismiss them completely and just have blind faith in everything. That isn't what we're saying at all. There are limits to reason.
I find atheists do this a lot. When you try and mention the inescapability of faith, or that, they automatically make this straw man and say, yeah, therefore you chuck out logic and flying horses, and you know, they just think it's, if you accept just the concept of faith, that basically means you've killed reason. I don't know why, but they have this. I don't know if you felt the same thing, but they have this.
It's a false dichotomy. They've set them as opposition to each other, like reason is light and faith is darkness. And when you have reason, it diminishes the darkness, and you know, there's no more room for the darkness anymore. And then someone comes along and go, maybe reason's a light, but that it can only shine on certain things. Maybe faith is like an ultraviolet light that might give rise to things that you wouldn't have seen with a normal light. And
or it might be the source, because you need a direction.
Yeah, maybe. And but this is the thing, it's not necessarily that they're opposed. They might be two forms of illumination. You know, they might.
But sorry to cut you off. Before I forget, I really had to chuck in this point, because I was going to bring it in earlier, but I completely forgot about it. You know Douglas Murray in his book, The Strange Death of Europe? Have you heard of it?
There, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, grab it. Bro, this book is sick. It is so good. Right, so in this book, although he's an atheist, he talks about the need for faith, right? And he speaks about that we still dream Christian dreams. And even our concepts that we have today, such as the concept of human rights and these types of religion, this new religion that we've made, these are all essentially based on the residual shell of Christian faith. And he even goes on to quote some Europeans who are non-believers, but who are saying we still need faith, as long as someone else does the faith believing, not them.
Yeah.
So, as a civilization, what Murray is saying is that Europe is going through a crisis of meaning, and they need some form of faith. And he said the future of Europe will depend upon how we treat our churches.
And look at how they're getting treated at the moment. They're being turned into museums. There's the church that I went to when I was younger, they demolished it and they moved it around and it's a lot smaller now, but it used to be a beautiful building, big stone thing, and so that's gone now, and there's just a patch of grass there where it used to be. And next to it there was something that was called the Catholic Social Club, and this was supposed to be a place where Catholics would go and be Catholic together and socialize. And it's really funny because it's not that at all. It's still called the Catholic Social Club, but I used to live near it, and so when I was going on a walk, I'd walk past it every now and then. And this one moment we were walking past, me and my wife, and there was a huge gang of you getting some water?
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right.
I'm like dying of thirst here.
Oh, no, don't worry, Bismillah. So yeah, we were walking past, and there was this very large gang of motorbikers. It was a biker gang, and they were called the the Devil's Advocates or something, or the Hell's Angels. It was some stereotypical biker gang name, and they had like pictures of Satan all over the back, and they're all having a party in this Catholic Social Club, and and basically it's just a pub with the name Catholic Social Club, and you know they host parties, and then they're not. They don't discriminate. So if Satanists want to come and have a party at the Catholic Social Club, you know, hurrah! You come and have your celebrations here. It's £50 per hour for the night. Or there's no. It's the words themselves they're just labels now. It's become hollow. The meaning, the content that used to be there has kind of dissolved. Which is this idea that Nietzsche puts across about the idea of God is dead. And you see it when you're looking at how the Catholics treat their places, and whether or not you can even call them Catholic now is debatable. But
it's almost comical. It's called like the Catholic club, and got like Hell's Angels or those types of people. And
it's something you'd expect in a comedy skit.
A comedy.
Yeah, like Little Britain or something. And like they'd be making a joke out of it, but it wasn't. It was like everyone was deadly serious. They were all like stood outside being serious biker gangs because they're like, like with the beers and that, talking and looking dead manly and scary. And it was just a really strange experience. But we've gone off a bit, trying to bring it back to where we were. So yeah, this idea of giving everything up, or the infinite resignation. He says infinite because he's everything, whatever there is, infinitely in the world, in the dunya, you relinquish it, you remove any attachment for it, and you do this with faith that you'll get it all back. And there's this paradox that appears, because like at this point you're like, what are you on about, Kierkegaard? So you want me to give everything up to get everything back? And he's using Abraham at this point to give this analogy as of someone who does this, who's a knight of faith. And
yeah,
so for Abraham, his son is everything, but he's willing to give up that everything with the hope that he'll get it all back. And he even recognizes the impossibility of such a thing, but he also simultaneously understands that what is this word like impossible? It's more of it's a subjective experience. Like, what do we truly know about what's impossible? When we throw that word about and we say, oh, this is impossible, that's impossible, like
that's still a faith-based thing, isn't it?
Yeah, in order to be able to know what is impossible, you have to pretty much have this kind of inexhaustible knowledge. Like for example, when someone says, oh, the laws of nature will never change, that's impossible. It's like, how do you know that? How do you know that how do you not know that the laws of nature as they are at the moment aren't determined by a higher principle? And, if you tweak this higher principle, the laws of nature as we know it would therefore change. Like when the whole thing with freezing point and boiling point, you change the pressure in the atmosphere, and these things become closer until there's a point where you reach triple point, water freezes and boils simultaneously. That weirds you out. There's videos of it on YouTube. I recommend watching it. It's strange to see water boiling and freezing at the same time, and you're watching it happen, and there's ice, and the ice is bubbling, and it's like, what's going on here? And like how, and so there's this idea of higher principles that unite things and separate things, and so the same can be applied to anything. And it might just be that these things are so far beyond our experience, beyond our ability to experiment and to verify, that we'll never truly know the answer to. And so long as we can never really truly know the answer to these questions, it can never be impossible. It can always be possible that something might occur that we would think wouldn't be possible at all. And so you've got to be wary of this word. But for Kierkegaard, he's admitting that it's impossible, but obviously not that much, because he's still.
Does he say it's impossible, or does he say it's absurd?
Yeah, I think he even uses the word impossible. Bear with me. See if. Despite same as Abraham with his son, despite how impossible such things may appear to the rational mind. So I make this mention in the article. So to the rational mind, something might come across as impossible.
Yeah.
And there is a submission to this impossible, or to at least to this experience. And you have to. There's a weird bit here, because you can't look at it as a literal impossibility. Because if it was, then there would be no getting his son back. With Abraham. But he's recognizing it as impossible, but then still believing that it's going to happen anyway, despite it being impossible.
Yeah.
So it's this weird play on paradox, submitting to things that your rational mind tells you otherwise wouldn't be the case. So with Abraham,
I think it's also worth highlighting here an important principle, which you get in other parts of the Quran. Because obviously when Kierkegaard is speaking about infinite servitude, or what's that word he used?
Infinite resignation.
Infinite resignation. So the equivalent is submission. That Ibrahim alayhi salam was asked by Allah, submit, and he said, I submit to the Lord of the worlds. Now what's interesting is, from the Islamic perspective, the test that you're given is in accordance to the faith that you already have. So it's like building upon layers. It's like, okay, so now you can lift 50 kg. God is telling you, right, you're going to need to lift 100 kg. And the person who hasn't lifted 50, they're not going to be told to lift 100. So Abraham saw miraculous signs before he's asked to make another great leap of faith.
Yeah.
And his faith is based upon the miracle that he was given a son at an old age.
Yeah. There was lots of signs as well. There was the people of Lot were destroyed.
The people of Lot. Also about
when he was thrown in the fire.
Thrown in the fire. Yes. So this reminds me of in Surah Maida chapter 5, the helpers of Jesus, the Hawariyun, they were asked. They asked Jesus for a sign. They said to him, give us a sign that a table comes down from heaven and that we eat from it, right? And they just wanted like something, even though they believed in Jesus, they wanted something like really to secure their faith. And then God says to them, yes, I'll send it down. But then if you disbelieve after this,
then there's no saving you at all. There's a similar moment with, was it Abraham as well? Where he says, it's not that I disbelieve,
yes,
Lord.
Yes.
It's just so that my heart may settle. He says,
yes.
Take these birds, train them,
and put them on the mountains,
kill them and put them on separate mountains, and then go back to your original place and call to them and they'll come to you. And and you know, there's all these signs that are occurring, and so it gets to a point where Abraham it's not possible for him to have any doubt anymore. And this thing needs to be clear as well, because it might come across like I'm completely in favor of everything that Kierkegaard says, and that's not the case. I'm trying to explain his work, but obviously he's using this in order to justify the absurdity, or what he sees as the absurdity of Christianity, and specifically with this idea of the Trinity and things like that. And he wants you to not think too hard about the idea of the Trinity. He wants you to just accept it with this leap of faith. So when I'm trying to explain this section, please don't assume that this necessarily all applies to Islam, and don't assume that both me or Subboor necessarily agree with everything that he's saying. I'm just trying to kind of express his work from thingy, and the reason will become clear as we kind of go through it. So where were we? So in giving everything up, he believes he'll get everything back, and that this is what the knight of faith does. And in giving everything up, he doesn't hold contempt or bitterness for what he's quote unquote lost, which is to say, like, for example, someone who is material and who is ingrained in the dunya and in the world, when they lose something material and they have a lot of love for it, they can resent the loss. You know, it can cause them great pain. And for the knight of faith, when he gives everything up, he's doing it voluntarily. He's submitting to its loss straight away. And when he's doing it in a way so that he's not holding any sort of attachment to them, and he doesn't necessarily miss they're losing them. And then weirdly enough, he starts referring to this this idea that they get it all back, or they at the end of that quote that I read. But he makes it with such accuracy, employs that he's continually getting finitude out of it. And so although he's given up the world, he's still experiencing it. It's still there for him to move through, to engage with. And in engaging with it, he's still able to savor the moment. He's still, it's not the things that he's not, that he's given up, that he's engaging with anymore. It's his experience of them and going through them. And so he's still able to savor moments. He's still able to feel joy in his engagement with these things. But when they are lost, or when they go away, he experiences no pain in their loss. And he constantly has faith that his sacrifice or his disenfranchisement is that the word? From the world will be rewarded. And, you know, this is same with Abraham and his son. Despite how impossible such things may appear to the rational mind, you know, he's completely committed to this idea that in giving it all up, in losing it, he'll get it all back boatloads. Like it'll, you know, eventually, whether it's after death or not, it's another thing. There's another bit. So I'm going to share a video clip with you. So there's a little quote. So every movement of infinity occurs with passion, and no reflection can bring about a movement. And this sounds like, again, just have blind faith. Just don't think, just act, and act passionately. And atheists, when they think of theists, generally tend to get this idea that this is what theists do, and only theists. And my argument is going to be that this doesn't apply to theists. We're finite beings, and the world comes at you quickly, and you don't always have time to reflect. It's an unfortunate part of being a human being. Sometimes you just have to act. You've not got enough time. And thinking too much about something can stunt you and can prevent you from experiencing life. And so this is, and you see this being expressed by atheistic movements, with the, you know, sayings like YOLO, like, you only live once, don't think about it too much, man, just jump off the cliff. Whoa, yeah. And
they're not really agnostic. they're like, yeah, there is no life but this life. Yeah,
but this is that saying, YOLO, is a very atheistic saying. You know, you only live once. There's a lot of presuppositions there, i.e., you're not going to live after you've died. You've got this one life, so live it, experience it. What that means is don't think too much. There was a guy I went to uni with, and
that's a good example.
But it's inescapable, and they have to come up with these concepts, because if you spend too much time standing around thinking about things, it can cause you issues. If you're stood at a gate or along a fence and you're looking into the water and you see there's a child drowning, and you spend too much time thinking, oh, but what if that child grows up to be a Hitler? Oh, that is possible. What if I drown when I'm trying to save the child? What if, you know, blah, blah, blah. And like, you're thinking about all these things and you're weighing them up. And by the time you've come to a decision, the kid's drowned. Sometimes you're not to think. Sometimes it's inappropriate to think. Sometimes you have to act. You need to, as Bruce Lee is about to say, don't think, feel. And I'm going to play that clip. It's only a short one, but it really gets the point across about this isn't just a theistic thing, and that it's not completely ridiculous. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, I can, yeah.
Okay. Can you hear it?
No.
Kick me. Kick
Did
me.
you hear that?
Nope.
You can't hear it?
No.
There, let's try again.
Maybe it's going to come out on your side. We can hear it.
It's a shame that you can't hear it, though. One second, let me try again.
Don't think, feel. You know, about that, that's the same as, you know, when you're born into a country, you automatically accept the social contract, you automatically accept the laws. No one grows up as a teenager and then starts thinking, well, I never wanted to be a British citizen. I never took the oath of allegiance. I never agreed to pay 17.5% VAT on Snickers. You know, we all, as soon as we're born, we accept a whole bunch of things.
Yeah. Well, you don't even accept them. You're not asked. You just you submit to it. It's I'll press play again. What I'll do as well is, if the volume doesn't turn up, I'll just extract the clip and I'll embed it into it myself. Got through on the recording.
I was reading. I couldn't hear it, but I was reading the.
So he basically he's saying, you know, where's the emotional content? He's saying kick, And the kid's kicking, but he's kicking like a robot, and he's not got any expression on his face. He's going over and he shouts at him, and he's like, "Where's the emotional content?" And then so the kid gets really angry, and he goes, "Ugh," and he goes, "No, I said, where's the emotional content? Not get angry." And so then the guy does it again, and then he gets it, and so then Bruce Lee says, "How did that feel?" And then the kid goes, "Let me think." And then it's at that point he slaps him, and he goes, "Don't think, feel." And then he points his finger to the moon, and he says, "It's like when someone points to the moon." And then the kid looks at his finger, and he slaps him on the head again. And he says, "Don't look at the finger, because then you'll miss all of that heavenly glory." And so, alhamdulillah, like it's a great. He's really good at explaining these kind of things. But he's talking of this idea of the necessity to not always think, and how thinking can get in the way of living, of action, of being able to do something, to accomplish something, and that sometimes you have to rely on your intuitions, and you have to learn how to deal with them, but not in this ridiculous kind of modern YOLO sense. Like, let me stop sharing this. So for Bruce Lee, he's not an advocate of like mindless hedonism, despite the fact that he's talking about this idea of don't think, feel, and this is it's very much neglected in the intellectual discussions that the atheists have, but it's an implicit part of their thinking. They do act like this.
I mean, it's completely inescapable. If you look at their arguments, the most powerful arguments that they have are not rational. They're emotional. You know, oh, religion causes bloodshed. Oh, why does evil happen in the world if God is all powerful?
Yeah, they're based on the feelings of uncomfortableness. Like, oh, I feel like it's wrong that things are happening in the world that I don't like. I feel like this, I feel like that. And they can give rational arguments beyond that feeling, and moving from that feeling, moving from that assumption. But there's always these underlying presuppositions, that they refuse to think about. And I say they generally, there might be some, or there probably is a few that they do consider these problems, and they do own up to it. And maybe they, as I kind of get through this now, they own up to what they have faith in, which is what I'm going to end up arguing here, that is absolutely necessary and completely important. And it's based on this idea that, you've only got so much life in you. You've not got time to think about absolutely everything.
There's a philosopher, his name is Michael Ruse. I mention him quite a lot on Darwinian Delusion. So he famously said that naturalism is an act of faith. He says that's one concession I'm willing to give.
Exactly. And because this is the thing, it's if you're making the claim there is no supernatural, or there isn't anything beyond the natural, you're making something like, first of all, there's no positive evidence for that claim. There's no like absolute rational, completely deductive arguments for that claim. It's an axiom, it's a presupposed assumption, and it's one that not everyone agrees with. And so, it's contestable. And so long as you're accepting it, and you can accept that there is an element of faith in that, then I will grant you that at least you've got a reasonable position, insofar as you're aware that you've made faith in something. And then I can grant I might not agree with it. I might admit that I have faith elsewhere. But at least we're on the same page in terms of what we admit we have faith in. What's really annoying is when they refuse to admit they have faith in things, and they talk as if they know everything. Well, not they know everything, because they will, bless them for it, admit that they don't know everything. But they act like they don't have faith in anything, and it's just not true. They have faith. It's a necessary part of being a finite being. It's a necessary part of having to live in a world and being able to act in the world. You have to have faith in elements of it. And if you don't, you can't, you get stuck, you can't move, you can't go beyond anything. Acting requires faith, especially for finite beings. And yes, and so there must be this kind of passionate pushing forward, according to Kierkegaard, that you must do it on the strength of the absurd. And infinite resignation is an absolute necessity in order for any of this to be acquired. You need to give up on, let go of your desire for the world, and that this letting go is the last stage before faith. And if you, and to give up on the world, that's necessary before you can even say you've got it. And this gives highlights an issue with materialism, insofar as you say that there is only the material. If you give that up, you're left with nothing. You're left with nihilism. And people don't want to be left with nihilism, so they focus on the material world, while at the same time saying it's all just dust. And so that they have this weird cognitive dissonance where everything that they value, everything that they love is worldly, but their own logic destroys any meaning in any of that. And so they love dust. They love something which they can't keep a hold of. It just falls through the hands, and it's an issue. And so for Kierkegaard, he's basically saying that in this resignation is the only way to gain peace or consolation in the pain. And the pain isn't necessary. By resigning from the world, it doesn't mean you're not going to feel pain anymore. It doesn't mean you're not going to suffer or feel sorrow. It just means that you gain peace in it, and that you don't recoil from it. You don't try to run away from it into other things. Like if you're an alcoholic, you might run away from pain into the beer. If you're a drug addict, you might run away from it into the needle. And basically, this resignation for Kierkegaard offers you an ability to bear pain despite its absurdity. And so one mustn't deny one's relationship to the world as absurd for him, nor to deny the impossible. So he's still saying there's an affirmation of the absurd and of the limits of reason and of understanding, because of this idea that impossible is, he doesn't say this explicitly, but this is what I kind of draw from his work. When we say something it's impossible, it's a subjective experience, it's an opinion. But it's objectively so that you experience something as impossible. Like if I'm stood outside and I keep trying to fly, before the invention of planes, like I'll say to myself, oh, it's impossible, I can never fly. A few centuries later, someone creates a device and you can fly. And so your rational mind was telling you something was impossible. You were trying to jump into the sky, you were flapping your arms about like a bird, and you never got that. And so you shout out to the world, oh, this is impossible. And it's a rational thing to shout out when you stood there trying to do it. But it doesn't mean the thing that you said is impossible, i.e. that you might fly one day. It doesn't mean that it actually is impossible. And let me just check my notes here. Yeah, and so for him as well, you mustn't think ill of the paradox. You mustn't, when you're confronted with a paradox, you shouldn't, again, recoil from it. You shouldn't hate it. You shouldn't get annoyed with it. And we get this, like, for example, with discussions about free will and determinism. We talked about before as well how when Muhammad Hijab was discussing with an ex-Muslim, and the ex-Muslim was pointing out, oh, well, how do we reconcile these ideas of free will with, fate and God being all-knowing and so on and so forth. And Muhammad Hijab rightly pointed out, well, even if you leave Islam, these problems don't go away. This is something atheists have to deal with. We have these ideas of law, all of which presuppose agency in the human being. the ability to make choices and responsibility for action. Yet we've got people like Sam Harris saying, oh, no one's making any choices. Everyone is completely determined. There's only input and output, and the output is completely determined by what goes in. And so free will is an illusion. No one has any choice. Determinism versus free will. And he still thinks we should have these laws, which presuppose all these things that he says, you know, that there's the cognitive dissonance there. He's holding an opinion.
Yeah.
And so that for Kierkegaard, he's basically saying these paradoxes, they appear. And regardless of how rational you are, regardless of how reasonable you might be, and regardless of whether or not you're accepting religion or not, whether you're a theist or an atheist, these paradoxes are constantly going to present themselves. And the paradox shouldn't necessarily be seen as something annoying, but it should be the expression of our limits, the expression of a presentation of the unknown, so to speak. And he also makes a point of saying that the leap of faith has been made into this, that people have been tricked into thinking the leap of faith is nothing. And he says it's not nothing. The leap of faith isn't this silly thing that you should just disregard and swipe away as something that's not serious. He says rather the leap of faith is the potential for everything. And to know for sure, you need to take the leap to experience it, to taste the apple. You need to submit to it. And even at that point, you've always got the chance of removing yourself from faith. You know, if it doesn't work for you, if you're not experiencing it after you've done it.
Yeah, I highlighted this part when I was reading your part, your dissertation earlier. That's the part I didn't agree with. That how could you go back? Because firstly, like you rightly point out in the dissertation, you'll go back to another form of faith, right?
Yeah.
You'll switch from one to the other. But this whole idea of, unless I misunderstood what he's saying, this idea that it didn't work, therefore you can turn back. The thing is, you wouldn't know if it's worked until you're dead. So it's like, it reminds me of those people who are like, oh, you know, I don't pray anymore because I used to pray and I didn't get an answer.
Well, it's the thing is there are people that do it. There are people who become believers and then further on down the point, they stop being believers. And, you know, we refer to these as apostates. So there are people that do it. And pointing out that they can do it doesn't mean that they should. It's just, you know what I mean? It's
that's what they do.
Yeah. And at least people that have tasted faith and that have been in that position, they're in a better position than people who have never tasted it at all and refuse to ever even approach it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so basically, it's
more of a descriptive thing rather than a prescriptive.
Yeah. Like, you've got to keep in mind as well, from an Islamic perspective, someone that leaves the faith after having been a part of it isn't in a better position than someone who hasn't ever experienced it. Because the person who hasn't experienced it is in a position of ignorance. And the person
that's a good point. Yeah.
And so a position of ignorance, it works in your favor, in your favor in terms of things that you do out of ignorance, not knowing necessarily, you know, what is right and wrong. So, for example, the person that's grown up in the woods without any contact to civilization, they're completely ignorant. They've not been given any guidance by anybody. They can't necessarily be held accountable for evil things that they may commit, because they didn't necessarily know any better. And so from an Islamic perspective, someone who leaves the faith, you know, in terms of before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're in a much worse position than someone who hasn't joined it, and someone who was, you know, born out or beyond it. Existentially, they're in a completely different position. What we're talking here is philosophically, so it's in a different sense. So if you've experienced faith and left it, at least you've experienced faith. And so you've got this.
Well, you experienced a type of faith because you're still going to have a faith on the other end.
Yeah. But I guess the difference is
You know about it.
yeah, you've tasted it. You can describe it to people, and you get this when you're talking to certain apostates. They'll describe what it was like to be a believer, and a lot of their arguments involve this kind of description. Or I was always anxious. Whenever I did something bad, I always felt guilty. I felt shame. And that's natural. It's the same for people who are still believers now. If you do something bad, you feel guilt and you feel shame. The only difference is we understand the importance of guilt and shame in correcting you. And I don't shy away from that. If I do something bad, I don't wish I didn't feel guilt. I'm happy. The fact that my heart still cries to me when I'm doing something that I shouldn't be doing is something that has helped motivate me to give up many things that I needed to give up. Smoking being one of them. I allowed myself to begin to hate myself for smoking, but that was only possible because of the guilt and shame that arose from doing it. And so for me, that was a good thing. Some people, if they desire the thing more than they desire to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the guilt is just something that's getting in the way of that desire. And so if this is already valued more than the one that made them, then it follows from that they would want to discard the thing that gives rise to the guilt and the shame more than the thing that they desire, the worldly thing. So that was just a kind of expression of that, but it's not necessarily a qualitative description. It's not that they're just because they've experienced faith, it doesn't make them superior to the person that hasn't ever experienced faith. It just means that they're in a better position to be able to describe what it is.
Well, you know what's interesting about that is that you find some atheist philosophers, they'll be very candid about the idea that they have faith, right? They won't shy away. They're not going to be like these militant new atheists who are pretending as if their worldview is just clear of any leaps of faith. It's all about going with the evidence that they actually have. What you'll find is that some philosophers, they'll be very they'll even speak about being uncomfortable. I think it's Thomas Nagel who said something to the effect of intelligent people who believe in God really make him uncomfortable because it makes him unsettled about his position.
I could probably work the other way around as well. Funnily enough, your video today, mashallah, it was a very good video. And the only thing I would say I disagree with is you didn't make a distinction between wisdom and intelligence. And it seemed like you were conflating the two. And for me, I would say there's intelligence doesn't necessarily equate to being wise. And so you can have people that have particular kinds of intelligence in certain things. So someone can be really intelligent when it comes to maths. Someone can be really intelligent when it comes to how to build a car, how to repair a car. Somebody can be really intelligent when it comes to how to deal with people. And there's different kinds of intelligence. And
social intelligence.
Exactly. And I would say that there's also a spiritual intelligence.
That's the missing link.
And so I think the issue, because you said there's no such thing as an intelligent atheist, and you might hold that position. I know there's many people that do. If you read the comments in your video, there's people that reiterate this point. But for me, I think there are intelligent atheists. I think the issue is that people can be so intelligent they can get themselves into a pickle. Like you can intelligently construct a structure of deception, and you can fall into the trap of your own creation. And you might not, and you might do that consciously, you might do that unconsciously. And the issue is again, it's to do with our finitude. It's to do with our limited perspective. In order to look at something, you have to neglect lots of other things. For me to focus upon your face, I have to neglect the bookcase behind me. And all the other things.
Opportunity cost.
Yeah, and the issue is that there's always more that's beyond what we're looking at or focused on than there is that we are looking at or focused on. And intelligence represents the ability to connect dots of things that you are engaging with and that you're aware of. And creativity, or creative intelligence, allows you to kind of extend beyond that. Now, what's really interesting is, and I've heard Richard Dawkins talk about this, the importance of creativity in scientific advancement, and how most of the biggest advancements occurred because of eureka moments. And what is a eureka? Let's ask the scientist. Oh, they don't know. They don't know what a eureka moment is. They don't know what gives rise to these bursts of inspiration that provide these huge developments in science. And so the thing that they're going on about, oh, reason this, rationality that, the thing that seems to give rise to its biggest movements, its quickest jumps, are blasts of creative inspiration. And that is a massive spanner in their work, because if that plays a major role and they don't understand what gives rise to it, what are we supposed to make of that? And
you just reminded me of something. I was Googling his name quickly, but I've forgotten his name. There's a famous scientist who was trying to work out the structure of something, and then he actually went to sleep, and then he saw it in a dream. And when he tested it out, it was actually the right answer. So from that, philosophers, they made a distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. So it doesn't matter if the context of discovery was really bizarre, was like a eureka moment, was like a dream or something else. As long as you can justify it later, it doesn't matter what the origin was. You're exactly right. A lot of these, the movements that went forward, the forward thrust of humanity, that was something bizarre. Even though penicillin was discovered, I'm not sure if you know about it, but penicillin wasn't like discovered in a very orthodox way. It was to do with some sort of, the guy, he was living in an apartment, and there was some, the plants were being affected by something, and it wasn't like a proper,
happy accidents.
Happy accidents, exactly.
There's enough examples of, like, if you look into the history of science, there's lots of these things that occur where, like, some there was another one where someone had something in their desk, and they had like film strips or something, and they put it in the drawer with this piece of uranium or something. I'm probably giving a completely wrong account. If anyone knows this story, please give me. I think it was on one of the crash course videos.
Right.
They're really good at this kind of thing. But yeah, someone put two things in a drawer. There was a reaction between these two things, and then he was like, "Oh, eureka! Look at that!" Like, and and it's these things that just kind of occur that by accident, that are a massive driving force in science. And this kind of, especially if you're a materialist, you have to boil it down to just like pure luck. that we've made these advancements at all, and it isn't necessarily a commitment to reason necessarily. It definitely plays a part, because like, for example, the person that put two things in the drawers, if he wasn't committed to reason to such a degree, he might have just pulled these things out and gone, oh, there was a ghost that did this to my thing, and he would never have explored it or developed on that idea.
The good thing is that some atheist philosophers, they actually speak about this sort of thing in a very open way. So Stephen Law, he once was speaking about justification, and he was like, Basically what it was, a few years ago, there was a debate. It was me and this other brother called Harun Qureshi, and we were debating Stephen Law and this other atheist. And when it came down to moral issues, I was trying to push him to try and say, look, you have to justify, your moral values, but how are you going to justify it? And he just said, look, it's a gut feeling.
An intuition.
And, yeah, and he also said this in another lecture somewhere else, that the idea you need to justify everything, like, it's not a view he holds. And that's quite interesting, that when you get past this veneer of discussion, of rationality, of going back and forth, and you come down to the real nuts and bolts of it, you start to realize you're in the domain of subjectivity. you're in the domain of leaps of faith,
You're in the perspective of life. It's unavoidable. You're a living being, and it's not completely possible to just transcend that, to leave it. And like this idea of getting to the objective perspective, it's an abstract idea that gives rise to a useful pragmatic method, which allows us to have pragmatic developments technologically, and it helps increase things like comfort, longevity, standards of life, etc. These are useful terms, like I say, that are pragmatic, but it doesn't mean that we've objectively achieved the objective perspective in any literal sense. We haven't. We're still humans. We're still stuck in bodies. We still have desires. We still fear death. We still, want to live and enjoy pleasures and live and overcome pain and things like that. And all of these things are inescapable. But
and when you rationalize, when you go into this hyper rational mode, you recognize you still don't act rationally. I remember speaking to a brother who, before becoming a Muslim, he was a militant atheist and he was a nihilist. He actually, it was quite interesting because he came from a Christian background. Then he became a nihilist, and he actually became a moral nihilist as well as an existential nihilist. So he actually said, I believe there was no such thing as right and wrong. And he actually, funnily enough, ran a drug business from his house, and he believed it was absolutely fine. But there came a point in his life where he started to feel like it was Groundhog Day. Every day was the same routine. Every day was the same routine. Everything was the same routine. So because he believed in this sort of hyper-rational behavior of everything has to be rationalized, he just thought to himself, life is pointless. I should just kill myself. There's no point going on. It's just like, it doesn't make any sense. I've done everything I wanted to do. It's pointless. I've got nothing to live for. And he said, I couldn't get around to killing myself because I had a fear that I may be wrong.
Yeah. This is a really, really good segue into the next section. So Albert Camus and the myth of Sisyphus. And so like I mentioned, he lived through World War II. He was familiar with both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. And he stated in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, it's an essay. It's a really short book, quite small. I think you can pick it up for about $5 off Amazon. And he says that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions, that this trumps all other philosophy. Forget it all. Forget like everything else. We need answers to this, the meaning of life. And he says one of the most important questions is, why not just commit suicide? Why not just, like, if life is just constant suffering, and he's not saying this facetiously.
He doesn't do any foreplay. He just goes straight.
No. Yeah, and he's not even being facetious. He's not being sarcastic. He's being deadly serious.
Oh my God.
This is a serious problem. Why not just avoid the suffering and just end it all now. And this is what his the story, the myth of Sisyphus, he's trying to approach this. And so I've got maybe one or two quotes of his that I'll kind of read throughout the explanation of it, but I'll just read this one. So this is, here we go. What then is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of sleep necessary to life? A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without a remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. All healthy men have thought of their own suicide. It can be seen without further explanation that there is a direct connection between this feeling and the longing for death, this feeling being the feeling of absurdity. And there seems, like he's kind of pointing out here, that there seems to be there's something to do with human nature, that being confronted with this idea of absurdity is something detrimental to life. Like you can't, it seems to kind of cause this reaction within the core of the human being that makes it just want to cease being altogether. And he kind of continues from this, and he mentions, kind of echoing Kierkegaard, that reason always gives rise to paradoxes, and absurdity always creeps in. And he talks about it. He says it's laughable to suggest that the world is intelligible, because the more you try to look into it, the more you look into it, the more absurd, the more mysterious it becomes. And you see this. So like we make these kind of big advancements in science, and they make these really amazing pictures, which simplify things, and we look at them and we go, wow, they're beautiful. The atom, I know I mentioned these examples quite a lot, but they're really good to kind of get these points across. So the atom is a beautiful picture, and it really does help to simplify the world. And you look at things like the periodic table and how the elements and that all kind of relate to each other. It might be complex if you're not really aware what's going on, but once you've kind of studied it a little bit, it's beautiful. And it really does help to understand the world and how it reacts to a certain degree. But then you look more into it, and it doesn't become more simple. It becomes more complex, and it becomes more mysterious, and more questions arise. And you see that when they start blasting atoms apart in hadron colliders, and they come up with these ideas of quarks and anti-quarks and whatever else. I can't remember all the technical terms, which is basically a good example of the point that it becomes so complex that it's beyond the grasp of the layman. It's beyond, they really have to oversimplify these discoveries so much that they don't do them any justice anymore. And for Camus at this point, you've got two options. Either you commit real suicide, or you commit philosophical suicide. And he refers to philosophical suicide as becoming religious. And he says that you will either generally go into one of the two of these positions, but he thinks that it's superior if you can submit to the absurd without either of the suicides. If you can submit to the absurdity to become a nihilist without committing suicide or becoming religious, then you somehow become this kind of superior being. And
you know what? Funny, I highlighted this earlier, and I wanted to ask you about it. Why does he equate physical suicide with going for faith?
He's not necessarily equating it. He's just pointing them out as two options. He probably sees actual suicide as superior.
Doesn't he call it philosophical suicide?
Yeah. So he refers to religion as philosophical suicide, because he's saying you're unwilling to confront the absurdity of the world, of life. And
I see, I see. So he's presupposing the absurdity of life is true.
Yeah. And that if you own up to this, then you get this kind of inner reaction at the core of your being, which forces you to want to end your life. And the only save, or the only antidote, or the only fix for that, for a lot of people, is just to become religious. And they do this because they don't want to die, because they want to experience life, but they can't handle the absurdity. And so for him, he's saying that it's natural to feel this kind of wanting to draw close to death, or to end one's life. And he basically wants you to kind of live through that. He's echoing this Nietzschean idea of moving through nihilism and to submit to it, without becoming religious. And he sees that if you can do that, that you've somehow kind of you've overcome a hurdle, and you've become this kind of superior human. And the myth of Sisyphus, for those who don't know, is it's an ancient Greek character, and he was known as Sisyphus, the great trickster. And he was punished by they refer to them as gods. Obviously, we don't see them as that, but he was punished by the Greek gods for misbehaving. And he was constantly playing tricks on the gods and getting away and escaping. And then there was something to do with basically, he told his wife, he wanted to test his wife's love for him. And so he said to her, when I die, take my body and throw it in the street and just leave me there in the dirt. And she goes, okay. And then he dies. And then she does. she takes his body and just throws him in the street, and then just leaves him dead and naked in the mud. And then he goes to the underworld, and he's really annoyed. He's like, if she loved me, she wouldn't have listened to that, and she would have just buried me. And so he's really ticked off that his wife just submitted to his command and just literally threw him out naked and dead. And so he complains to the gods, and he says, listen, let me go back and let me chastise my wife for being so unwifely, and then I'll come back. And so they hear his story, and they agree, and they let him go. But he tricks them, and he doesn't bother. And he falls in love with life again, and so he runs around, and like he never returns. And so they end up getting hold of him again. And there's basically a couple of moments where he keeps tricking the gods and escaping death, because he loves life so much. But then eventually, it gets to a point where they curse him, and his punishment is to push a rock up a hill. And every time he gets to the top of the hill, the rock rolls all the way back down. He's got to turn around, walk all the way back, get the rock, and push it up again. And he has to do that for an eternity. And so you've probably seen the image of this man trying to climb a hill, and he's got this big rock, and he's punishing it. Now, when people hear that, for Camus as well, this is very analogous to life. Life is this repetitive, almost meaningless. When people talk about the rat race, they go, and the way you were talking about that person you knew, he convinced himself there was no such thing as right and wrong, and it was fine to do whatever he was doing. But eventually, he felt repetitive. It felt like it was Groundhog Day. He was just doing the same thing. There was no content to it. There was no meaning behind it. There was no purpose. It was a punishment. It was repetitive. Now, for Camus, when you look at the myth of Sisyphus like this, then you are committing suicide in one of these ways. You're either committing, not necessarily. Sorry, that's a bit of a mistake. Yeah, but if you see him as unhappy, then you've completely missed the point, according to Camus. For Camus, you have to imagine Sisyphus happy, and so this is the conclusion of his essay. Sisyphus owns his fate, and he pushes the rock, and he does it passionately, and somehow, like, it's really weird how he kind of comes to this conclusion. If you read the essay, it'll do more justice than I can do. But this is the kind of thing he ends up trying to argue for, that he kind of owns his existence as repetitive, and he makes it his own, and he's able to enjoy it. And yeah, so how he gets there is a bit precarious. I don't agree with the way he gets there. It feels more rhetorical, and again, not reasoned, and there's a lot of faith going on there, and it's a lot of it's basically to do with this idea that of absurdity. And he gets to a point where I'm just going to read my notes to remind me what was going on in the essay. Oh yeah, so he has he makes a statement that where you become convinced that the human that you become convinced of the human origin of all that is human. Do you need the toilet?
No, I'm actually staying awake.
Oh, okay. I'm not boring you, am I? We can pause and carry on another time if you want.
No. I'm what's it called? Basically, I was about to fall asleep on the sofa, so I stood up. That's why.
Oh, okay. Right, we've
No,
not got too much.
I'm actually enjoying this. It's
just late. There you are. What time is it now?
No, it's getting close to 12 o'clock. If I carried on sitting down, I was yawning, so I was like, no, I'm going to stand up and enjoy this.
Okay. We've not got that much long left to go anyway. We can kind of power through this. And
just a quick thing before you get into it. Unless I misread the essay, is he basically saying that life is absurd?
Yep.
And what's his name? Syphilis, right?
Sisyphus, yeah.
Sisyphus, that's a disease. This Greek guy, right? So he's happy because he is purely accepting the absurdity without delusion.
Yeah, and he owns it. It's his. So he's happy.
I didn't fully get why he's happy.
I'll basically the conclusion comes in the last few pages of his essay called The Myth of Sisyphus. It's not analytically reasoned. Like, it's a very rhetorical argument. He's trying to push you in this direction in a weird way. Like, he can't use reason. He's kind of, well, he's using reason, but life is absurd, and so paradox. So he's submitting to this paradox. He's saying, reason always gives rise to these paradoxes, and I'm giving you an essay that's kind of making use of reason and rhetoric, because I need to kind of convince you of this conclusion, and the conclusion is that Sisyphus is happy, and I need to take you there and get you to understand it with me. And I'm doing that with argument. I'm doing that with words, and a big part of all of this is using logic and reason. But he's already said that it's absurd. He's already said that it's weird. And I made mention of him in the other essay that we went through. I think it was the Science is Art one, where he talks about the scientist, when the scientist talks to him of this planetary world of atoms, and then he realizes that you've been reduced to art. And he's very conscious of this idea that everything is absurd, that even those most committed to reason, the scientists and things like that, that they inevitably can't escape these paradoxes, this absurdity, this need to lie in favor of truth, all of these things. And so he's in this weird place. It's a great book, and I recommend reading it. Like, it's a really good read. And he's good at getting you filled up with passion while you're reading it. But again, it's because you're aware that he's wary of reason, that he thinks everything is absurd. You have to ask, so what is it that he's using to drive me in this direction with him? And why? And his reason is because he loves life. He doesn't want to commit suicide, and he's understanding that a life without meaning. Say again?
It's almost like a choice. Like, he has the freedom and he decides to take the blue pill.
Yeah, basically, to some degree. he doesn't. Well, he's looking at the other two choices, and he's like, well, I don't want to die. I don't want to commit suicide. He's like, and I don't want to become religious. But then he's aware that there's a problem with this kind of like, well, he must have been aware that there's a problem with this meaningless hedonism. That how are you supposed to gain any sort of enjoyment from hedonism if it's all meaningless? So he has to instill it with meaning somehow, and so this is his method of doing so. And basically, why, and I'll kind of explain to it. So he says that he's convinced of the human origin of all things human, and I, in my essay, draw contention with this, and I say this is an issue because this is an assumption that all things human have a completely human origin. You know,
I didn't understand this part when I was reading it.
Okay, so basically this bit is a leap. He's making the assumption that anything that we call human or anything that's from the human has a solely human origin. This disregards the possibility that the things that belong to the human being, its qualities, its essence, etc., came from anything transcendent.
Oh, I see. Okay, I get it now.
Okay, so there's no possibility that what we're referring to as human has anything other than a human origin. So to be religious has a solely human origin. There's no way that it came from anything else. And so my argument here is that this is itself that something, this hasn't been proven, and it's not been proven with science. It's not. He's already wary of science anyway. He thinks it's all absurd, but he says this, and he's convinced of it.
Okay,
and
so just a quick question here, yeah. So he is an atheist.
Kind of. He's saying it's absurd. He's not saying that he knows God doesn't exist.
Okay.
So he's agnostic in a way, but he's...
Because when I was reading your, unless I misunderstood it, what it seemed like is when you were dealing with two responses to nihilism, you're dealing with a theistic and an atheistic, unless I read that myself in my mind. Camus sort of represented the atheistic, and
Kierkegaard represents theistic. Camus represents the not theistic.
Not theistic. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood that. Okay, that's right.
And he may have been an atheist, and he might have actively held that belief, but I don't want to say that he definitely was, because there is a suggestion that he may have just been agnostic. He may have been unwilling to...
I heard this about Nietzsche, that he wasn't actually an atheist.
No, well, he even said that it's very possible that God exists. He was never...
Really?
Yeah. He said it's possible that he exists. He just didn't care. He was like, it was, and it's not something that he thinks he can prove or disprove. He was just observing things, and he was saying, well, this is where things are going inevitably. What are we going to do about that? And so he offered certain fixes for that. But he was completely open to the possibility that he was wrong. So he wasn't an atheist. I can say that for certain about Friedrich Nietzsche. I can't say that for certain with Camus. For example, for this point here that he makes, being convinced of the human origin of all things that are human. That sounds like a very atheistic thing. It sounds like Feuerbach, who made the claim that this idea of God, of religion, is of a human origin. And Feuerbach was one of the close friends of Marx, and who gave rise or influenced Marx's materialism and his anti-religious rhetoric. And so this kind of echoes that a little bit, which gives the impression that he may have been atheistic, but I don't want to kind of say that he completely is. But the point of this basically is that I in my essay hold issue with this particular statement, that he's convinced of the human origin of all things human. And I highlight this in particular as a leap. This is a leap of faith. And his arguments, they may be very rhetorically motivating, but he's not giving rational reasons to support this conclusion. He just throws it in.
Well, the thing is, if Kierkegaard can do that, because that's what he does.
But he owns up to it as well.
Yeah, he's open.
He says, I have leaps of faith, and I
Yeah.
think it's important, and I've experienced it. Camus, he's the complete opposite. He chastises Kierkegaard specifically for the leap of faith, and he even refers to him as deceitful. And so there's this quote here. It's the last quote that I'll read, inshallah. The leap does not represent an extreme danger as Kierkegaard would like it to do. The danger, on the contrary, lies in the subtle instant that precedes the leap, being able to remain on that dizzying crest. That is integrity, and the rest is subterfuge being deceit. I know also that never has helplessness inspired such striking harmonies as those of Kierkegaard. But if helplessness has its place in the indifferent landscapes of history, it has none in a reasoning whose exigence is now known. And, for him, he kind of paints this picture of being stood on the dizzying crest, looking out into the absurd. And, Kierkegaard is making this leap into it. And all of his arguments are just deceit to try to convince you to make this leap. And Camus was this kind of, he saw himself as this really edgy guy. Like he thought he was cool. He had this cool guy jacket, and he used to if you search pictures of him, he's always got like a cigarette in his mouth, and he was a very good looking man. He had lots of female followers, and he was known for, he had a wife, but he had lots of mistresses, and he died very early in a car crash. So he was, he was a proper YOLO man. He was speeding in a car and crashed into a tree, and it killed him. And he was really young when it happened as well. So he was very much into this living life, and he was an odd character, but like I say, he thought of himself, or he comes across as someone who saw himself as very edgy, as dangerous, and here he's kind of saying this is what Kierkegaard was trying to be, but he was wrong. What is dangerous is standing on the edge and just looking over, but refusing to make the jump, and kind of standing there and staying on the edge instead of leaping. And the reason this is a leap of faith as well, despite him chastising the idea of a leap of faith and ridiculing Kierkegaard for making leaps of faith, he's assuming that there's nothing to be gained from Kierkegaard's leap. And the reason he's assuming it is because he hasn't experienced Kierkegaard's leap of faith. He hasn't acted it out. He doesn't know if there's anything to gain, because like we mentioned earlier in my description of Kierkegaard's Night of Faith, faith, like meaning, is something experienced, not something explained rationally. And you have to take the leap in order to reap its fruits. And insofar as Kierkegaard is standing on the edge, acting big man without trying to jump off and without trying to do it.
Kierkegaard came Camus.
Camus, yeah. You know what I mean. So he's assuming that no truths will be revealed without knowing for sure.
Yes.
And he can't know for sure, because if the leap of faith does in fact reveal truths to you, like we were talking about before, the leap of faith itself being a light, like a UV light, that reveals certain things that don't under normal light, and that they're not necessarily light and darkness. They're not. It might be a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't know that for sure, and he's assuming the moment preceding the leap is superior without experiencing the moment after the leap. He has no idea. Yeah. And so this brings it back to the thing we were talking about before. For me, the one who takes the leap and has knowledge of both positions, in this sense, philosophically, is superior. Islamically, the one who takes the leap into faith is even more superior than the one who takes the leap out. And we have our reasons for believing that. And that's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of the universe. We have our reasons for believing in him, in the Quran, and in the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so if you're making a leap of faith into this, even, because like I was saying, I don't think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an elitist. And he makes belief in him available to the intellectual and the non-intellectual alike. And that the method and the way he guides people is unique to each individual. And we can't expect everyone to be engaging in these abstract philosophical discussions, because a lot of it is beyond the layman. And this isn't a bad thing. People need to be able to stay in their lane without being made to feel guilty about that. Someone who's a farmer doesn't need to necessarily know about philosophy. And it wouldn't even necessarily help him if he starts reading Kierkegaard and he's like, why not just kill yourself? Like, that's an issue. He doesn't need to, like, he's got a farm to deal with here. Like, why does he need to get into this whole hedonism thing if he's got responsibilities? He's got a family to provide for. He's got children he needs to feed. He needs to work. He needs to continue that. And he needs to be able to provide for his family. If he starts engaging with philosophy too much, it's going to send his head west. He's going to lose sense of responsibility if he starts accepting these things. If he starts to gain this idea of freedom is the highest value and not having responsibility for others, but only being responsible for yourself, this is going to cause an issue societally, but even more so for his family, like for the people that, you know, require his care and require him to have responsibility over them. And so you can't say that everyone needs to be an intellectual. You can't say that everyone needs to have rational arguments. And I'm not saying that there aren't rational arguments. And I'm not saying that there aren't intellectuals that can engage with these and that these can be convincing. I engage with them. I find them convincing. I know people who do, brothers like yourself, like Amin, like, you know, the Andalusian Project, or Abdullah Andalusi. All of these brothers engage in very abstract and esoteric philosophical debate, and they're obviously intelligent and they're capable of doing so, and they find it convincing. But it would be completely unfair to expect everybody to be able to do this, and it's unreasonable for the atheists to do it. And it's why they need to also engage in what they're referring to as indoctrination when they talk about it, when it's also just education when it comes to them at an early age, when people are children. And so the one who leaps has knowledge of both positions. The one who leaps into faith is, you know, he's in a better position than Camus, who just refuses to make the leap at all and just wants to stand at the edge of the cliff with his cigarette and his collar popped and, you know, acting all edgy. And like I mentioned as well, the bit that you said you disagreed with, you can always undo the leap. And I would disagree there as well. I would say that you can do it. I don't think you should do it. And you can always...
What I meant by that is that, okay, so let's go back to the story of Abraham, yeah? So the leap he is supposed to take is to take the life of his son. And just before he took it, like when he put the knife on the neck, then God sent down the ram.
Yeah.
So if he backed out, if he chickened out 5 minutes before, he didn't actually take the leap of faith. That's what I meant. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is with that is he did get his son back straight away. He didn't have to kill his son.
So
the impossible occurred for him.
So when I'm talking about leap of faith, I'm talking about, maybe this is my own perception, right? I'm actually speaking about death. Because death for the believer, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said is a gift, right? And one of the topics that I think about almost all day long is death, right? That's like the one thing which I used to shy away from, but now I'm very like comfortable with it compared to before. And for me, the leap of faith, for it to be complete, it has to end with death. It can't just be like, okay, I tried praying, it didn't really work. That's why I was disagreeing with that point.
That makes sense, because once you're dead, you're dead. There's no coming back from that. But I wouldn't say that isn't necessarily coming back from the leap of faith, or what coming back from the leap of faith is referring to. That's just the conclusion of the story. And for me, like I was mentioning in this essay, that as much as Kierkegaard is trying to just chastise, as much as Camus is trying to chastise Kierkegaard for making leaps of faith, like his work is filled with it. And it has to be, because he thinks life is absurd. And if life is absurd, like what, you've not got justification for decisions, because your justifications are absurd. Everything is absurd. His whole work is absurd. And any answer he gives in response to it, necessarily has to be absurd as well. And what that means is that everything that he suggests is absurd. And,
Yeah.
you know, it's therefore, if you're going to commit to it, you have to take a leap of faith that it is somehow superior to any other way of reacting to the absurd. It's riddled with it. He's not escaped it. The only what makes him distinct from Kierkegaard is the fact that he hasn't noticed he's making leaps of faith, and he's ridiculing it. He's unknowingly and unconsciously a hypocrite. Whereas Kierkegaard, he's owning up to these paradoxes. He's owning up to what he's seeing as completely absurd. And he's fine with it. He's like, yeah, I'm making this. And Camus could have done that. He could have said, like, that part of his work, it wasn't necessary for it. It doesn't have to be there. He could have still come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, but the problem is that he will then lose the power of looking rational.
I don't think he cares about that. All he wants you to do is, in the end, imagine Sisyphus happy. And I think he could have still achieved that, even if he'd have owned up to his leaps of faith. He could have implemented that and still come to the conclusion that Sisyphus is happy because he's made leaps of faith that his life is his own.
Yeah, but then his particular view would be not different to the view of Kierkegaard, because the whole thing about Camus is that he's saying that look how ridiculous that is. Do you see? Because
that's not the whole point of his work, though, because they have a lot of parallel. Yeah. What makes him distinct in a particular regard is that he refuses to acknowledge his leap of faith. But just if he did acknowledge the leap of faith, it doesn't mean that there's still not elements that still make him distinct from Kierkegaard. He is, and in my work I mentioned this. He's distinct in the sense that he's still making a leap of faith, and so in that way he's similar to Kierkegaard. He's doing it in a different direction, and this is where they become distinct. Kierkegaard is leaping into faith with religion, and Camus is moving away from religion. He's saying that no, religion is philosophical suicide, and you don't need to do that, and you don't need to commit actual suicide. If you want, we can jump in this direction. And he's trying to convince you to jump in that direction, but he's somehow convincing himself that he's not jumping. He's not making any leaps, and he's convinced himself it's superior. And he wants to convince you to take that leap with him, while, ironically, using subterfuge, being deceitful in his language, chastising something and making you think that you're not going to engage in this thing while you're going to engage in it. He wants you to leap with him. He wants you to imagine Sisyphus happy, and it's not obvious that he is. And you've got to trust him, and that if you make that decision with him, that you'll be happy as well.
He set the trend for new atheist leaders and popularizers, because this is exactly what they do. They ridicule faith, yet their whole system is based upon some sort of faith. A few years ago, when I was reading the God Delusion, one thing just stuck out at me, and it stuck out at me like a lightning bolt, is that Dawkins, throughout the book, he keeps ridiculing faith. And then he has this point, which he calls the central argument of the book, which is like 6 points and then a conclusion, 6 premises and a conclusion. And his argument goes as this. He says, biology has given us a naturalistic understanding of design. So we know that biological systems evolved, they weren't designed. The universe also looks designed. However, we were wrong about biological design, so we may be wrong about physical design, and it may turn out that there is a naturalistic explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. So going by that,
there's a lot of ifs and buts.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. He basically makes this giant leap of faith from biology to physics. And throughout the whole book, he's talking about how faith is ridiculous. So, you know, they're following in Camus' tradition here.
Yeah, exactly. And if they want they can do that. I don't care. They can make the leaps of faith from biology to physics. They can make the leap of faith from things may seem designed, but they're not. And they can do whatever they want, so long as they're owning up to the things that they have faith in. If they can come up to me and say, listen, I'm an atheist, I believe in naturalism, there isn't any scientific evidence that naturalism is necessarily true, and it might be wrong, but I incline to this more than I incline to ideas of the supernatural.
I would respect them.
Yeah, fine. Go for it. You do you, I'll do me. But
yeah, all I hear is, well, what's the alternative? But that's not an argument. There's this debate between this...
what's the alternative? Suicide?
Yeah. No.
Or religion?
It was about scientism, right? So this atheist, he was openly saying that he believes science is the main root of knowledge, and he was openly advocating scientism. And the Muslim said to him, well, what's the proof that scientism is right? Let's put aside whether Islam's right. What's the proof that scientism's right? And the guy just turned around and says, well, what's the alternative? But that's not really an argument.
No, it's just a lack of choice.
Or lack of creativity, you know?
Oh yeah, that as well. But yeah, that's pretty much the concluding point of part 2. We've been speaking for about 2 hours now, and I have a very good feeling my wife is going to be fuming with me, because we were supposed to start at 4 and I should have been finished ages ago. But
yeah. Sorry about me feeling sleepy, but literally here, I think I told you this before, that it gets very, very cold, and in the house is colder. And when I wrap myself in something like this here, your body starts slowing down. You start falling asleep.
Yeah. Well, it's quite late where you are as well. There's a big time difference between here.
If I didn't stand up, I might have fallen asleep during you talking.
It's a good response. So long as I wasn't boring you to sleep.
No, it wasn't. You know, I was thinking about something before we started. I was thinking you can expand upon the dissertation and make it into a book, inshallah.
Inshallah, maybe.
Because I was thinking, there's nothing I have seen. There is actually good scholarly work on nihilism, but nothing from the Islamic perspective. And that would be really interesting, that you're juxtaposing nihilism, but you're also giving how Islam also has a response to it. It is something which I see more and more that atheists are willing to talk about. When previously they were like, oh, it's not a problem, or whatever, you know, life still has meaning.
Yeah, I think it's being popularized by people like Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, yes. And you know, yes. the likes, and they're owning up to it because I think they're being forced into it. You have these massive problems with suicide, depression, and it very much so within large groups of men, young men specifically. They feel disenfranchised. There's a lot of issues with nihilism, and it's becoming more and more evident, ironically, because of the science. And so, yeah, it is something that we need to kind of focus on. And to be honest, I have been thinking about turning this into a book. The idea that he puts forward in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard, I really wanted to kind of expand on this idea of how the Islamic perspective of that story, the subtle changes in it, completely reinvent the story and change a lot.
Wow, that's a good point.
The issues between the different children highlights some interesting points, and also the fact that his son knew, and it wasn't a secret. And also that it's not as much as a leap of faith for Abraham at this point. And so, like, his argument really builds up on the fact that Abraham is the master of faith, or the father of faith, the knight of faith. He is the archetype of this. And, you know, from an Islamic perspective, at least, that, you know, that at this point in his life, it would be silly for him not to consider himself to know God exists.
Yeah.
At this point, there's no room for faith, like you mentioned with the Jesus story. Once the table descended from heaven, like if you disbelieve at this point, and you're sat here with Jesus alayhi salam, and you're eating a heavenly meal, like move away from this now if you wish, but you know, to your own detriment. And for Abraham, you know, he'd been in and out of fire and he survived it. Like he went on this massive journey, you know, out into the nowhere, and he came across all these things. He grew to over 100 years old in the last moments, when he thought
he spoke directly to angels.
He spoke directly to angels who told him they were on the way to destroy a city, and then the city was destroyed. His nephew, Lot, was also a prophet, and so he had, you know, someone else to discuss these things with. And if neither of them came across, because this is the thing, crazy people are identifiably crazy, and the prophets, they don't act crazy. They don't, you know, they're known as people that are able to kind of engage with other people and not come across as completely insane. That, you know, they're able to become leaders and things like that. And it's an interesting thing. So I was thinking of maybe kind of delving into that, but I'm gonna have to go now. My daughter's on her way to bed, and she's just broke into my office.
Jazakallah khair for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Jazakallah khair again. And
so we're going to do, inshallah, part 4 of nihilism again on Friday. And make sure you read the dissertation and also subscribe to Yusuf's channel and keep up the support. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Just to conclude so quickly, I don't think we're going to be able to finish part 3 in one episode because that's 4 sections. But we'll go through as much as we possibly can, and yeah, so we'll leave it till next week.
You may have to repeat doing that, edit that part out, because your daughter came in the back, and I'm not sure if you're going to have her on the.
I can blur it. I'll blur her.
Okay. All right, bro. Assalamu alaikum.
All right. Wa alaikum salam.